Thank you for joining us today for my presentation. So the topic of my presentation looked at the relationships between socioeconomic factors, percentage of forest cover, and tree conservation bylaws in Ontario municipalities. So just a little bit about how the municipalities are divided in Ontario. There are a total of 444 municipalities that include your upper tiers, lower tiers, and single tiers. So upper tiers are places like your region of Peel, region of York, places like Brampton, Mississauga, Vaughan are your lower tiers. And then the city of Hamilton would be something considered as a single tier. And each of these municipalities pass bylaws using the authority given to them by the Municipal Act of 2001, which gives the discretion upon the individual municipalities to introduce and any tree protection bylaws. So out of all the 444 municipalities, there are a total of 412 lower tier and single tier municipalities, with only some of them having tree protection bylaws. And with Ontario occupying about 18% of Canada's 400 million hectares of forest cover, it is important that these municipalities take care of the forests in and around them. And although there are tree bylaws present in some of these municipalities, not all of them require good forestry practices when they're issuing harvesting permits. And so the question arises, why is this the case? It could be attributed to several reasons, but it is always interesting to look at the influence of socioeconomic factors on different urban outcomes. So then what exactly is the question that we will be looking at in this presentation? Do forest cover and socioeconomic factors influence the enactment of such bylaws? Before I move forward, I quickly wanted to put up the definition of good forestry practice for those who are not familiar with it, and it relates to proper harvesting and renewal practices that take into account the ecosystem health of the places where trees are being harvested. So what does the literature say about socioeconomic factors influencing the development of forestry-related legislation? It was found that urban forestry programs on street trees and public lands may contribute to lesser vegetation in poorer neighborhoods, as the residents often lack the resources to enhance the tree cover on their own property and even maintain it. And this highlighted the fact that existence of urban forest policy is not necessarily enough to ensure equal access to urban forests across a municipality. It was also found that municipalities with higher populations have more tree-related bylaws, which could be a result of several different factors, such as more political will, more funding, higher enforcement capacity, and an overall higher pressure from residents towards creating and implementing bylaws for these municipalities. When talking about tree cover, while one study found that increases in population density lead to decreases in urban tree cover, another one found no relationship between these two factors. And perhaps the one that I thought was the most interesting study found that the British community from their respondents preferred to plant shade trees, whereas the Italian and the Portuguese community favored fruit trees, and the Chinese community preferred having no trees. Therefore, cultural differences can play an important role in the ways people perceive and use nature around them. This map over here shows a portion of southern Ontario depicting great variation in the types of land cover in Ontario, with more forest cover loss as one moves south to the province. And in the north, there's more green cover and agriculture to the south, and the gray areas showing your urban land cover. And so the question arises, does this pattern of land cover change the influence of enactment of forestry legislation in these Ontario municipalities? So we wanted to examine if any of these trends identified in the literature would hold true for Ontario. We had some of these objectives for this project. We wanted to, first of all, collect and compile information on forestry bylaws in Ontario's lower tier and single tier municipalities. and see which municipalities had bylaws and which had bylaws with good forestry practice within them. We also wanted to investigate the influence of land cover, such as urban, agriculture, and forested land cover in these municipalities on the enactment and enactment of forestry bylaws and the inclusion of good forestry practices within them. And lastly, we wanted to investigate the influence of socioeconomic factors such as population density, education, income, and the percentage of immigrants on the forestry bylaw enactment. So how did we collect the data for our analysis? I searched online for the information regarding all 412 municipalities to determine the presence or absence of tree-related bylaws and the presence or absence of good forestry practice within the bylaws. Most of these municipalities have their own websites. So when a Google search did not generate any results, I checked on these individual websites to see if there were any tree bylaws, but with different names. And so our predictor variables that we collected the information about included percentage land cover types such as forest, agriculture, urban, population density, average household income, percentage of population with post-secondary education, and the percentage of people who identified as immigrants. This information was collected from Statistics Canada's website that had very detailed census data from 2016. And once we had all of our information, we combined it and analyzed it using logistic regression in R. And we also generated some maps using the data collected and plotted them in ArcGIS. So what did we find? We found that out of all the 412 municipalities, only 107 had a tree-related bylaw. And of these 107, only 66 had good forestry practices mentioned within the bylaw. At this point, I would like to point out that defining good forestry practice within a bylaw does not always mean that a municipality incorporates it into their application process for a tree cutting permit. This would be an important additional aspect to incorporate into future analysis, but would have been too broad for the scope of this project. So this map over here shows a comparison of the municipalities that have bylaws, tree conservation or preservation, and the municipalities that have bylaws that contain good forestry practice within them. And you can see that although there's a lot more tree bylaws, I don't know if you can see clearly in this map, but the very light green municipalities are the ones that have good forestry practice in them. So let's go to the results section and we'll be looking at the results in order of statistical significance. So let's talk about population density. So population density showed a significant relationship to the presence or absence of tree bylaws, where higher population density meant that you would have a tree bylaw, but it had a converse relationship with the presence of good forestry practice within the bylaw, and meant that places with higher population density would have a tree bylaw, but those bylaws would not have good forestry practice within them. For the percentage of people who identified as immigrants, you can see that places with higher number of immigrants do have tree-related bylaws, but again, those bylaws do not contain good forestry practices within them. Forest land cover showed that places with high forest land cover did not have any tree-related bylaws, and places that did have tree-related bylaws, only those places with a little bit more forest land cover had good forestry practices within the bylaws, and places that had very less tree cover had no good forestry practice within the bylaw. Percentage of secondary education did not show us any significant results, and same goes for average household income.
A minute, Mark.
Thank you. But of course, these variables are themselves intercorrelated. These principal component plots show that these intercorrelations with arrows pointing the same way, indicating high correlations. So in the left-hand plot, the presence of a tree bylaw was related to municipalities on the left, namely those with high densities, urbanization, and high number of immigrants. In the right-hand plot, the presence of good forestry practice was related to municipalities with lower densities, urbanization, and immigrants. And the map here just shows a comparison of the municipalities that have tree bylaws with good forestry practice within them. And the one on the right just shows the distribution of the forest land cover in those municipalities. So you can see places that have the least amount of forest cover towards Southern Ontario. They're the ones that have tree bylaws with good forestry practice in them. And this map here just shows a distribution of the immigrant population across Ontario. And you can see the dark blue areas that have tree bylaws, they show a higher number of immigrants within them. So we conducted a test to see which municipalities have tree bylaws and should have good forestry practices, but do not. And the following list was generated. And you can see some of these townships are cities. And similarly, we conducted a test to look at municipalities that were expected to not have good forestry practice in their bylaws yet, but still had included them. And the following list was generated, such as Kitchener and London, Whitby. So we can call them our laggards or champions, and we'll come back to them later in the presentation.
12-minute mark.
Thank you. It was seen that while municipalities with higher population have tree bylaws, most of them do not contain good forestry practices and hence are not stringent. It was also found that such municipalities have lower forest covers as compared to the ones without any bylaws. This could reflect that bylaws were introduced after massive degradation of the forests in these municipalities had already taken place. And lastly, higher population density and percentage of immigrants was observed in municipalities with tree bylaws that did not include good forestry practice as a component, whereas income and percentage of post-secondary education showed little to no connection to the presence or absence of tree bylaws and the presence of good forestry practice. So there can be various possible interpretations to these results, but the simplest one is that the municipalities with relatively fewer trees need tree protection bylaws, but they don't necessarily have to contain good forestry practice within the bylaw because those ecosystems are already very degraded. So what are we recommending then? We recommend that municipalities that don't have much forest cover remaining, it is important to have a tree bylaw as seen in the results to protect whatever little forest remains. Additionally, lesser forest cover might not require good forestry practice. Champions should reach out to the laggards and help them to promote bylaws and forestry practice, creating inter-municipality accountability. And there's also an urgent need for a collective action on the part of all Ontario municipalities with and without tree bylaws and the ones with high forest covers to develop tree protection policies and bylaws. Public education is an important part of this goal to ensure compliance and the protection of precious forest ecosystems. For the municipalities with tree bylaws but without good forestry practice, it is necessary to amend the bylaw to make it more comprehensive as the protection of the remaining forest cover in these municipalities is crucial. And lastly, the municipalities with tree bylaws that have good forestry practice can increase their enforcement to ensure no illegal harvesting on private property takes place. Municipalities should collaborate with each other to develop and update comprehensive and standardized tree protection guidelines and bylaws to protect forest resources from stresses incurred because of an ever-increasing urban land cover and also global climate change. With that, I would like to acknowledge some very important people who made this project possible. So Jay Malcolm for all his support doing the data collection and analysis. And Dave Payne from the OPFA, who I worked with throughout the summer, and he's been a great mentor, and everything that I've learned about the bylaws has come from his education. Daniela helped me develop the topic of my bylaw, Ontario Professional Foresters Association, because they gave me a chance to work on a project like this. My family, who's probably listening right now, and my sister, who actually helped me pull through any difficulties I had. And with that, my presentation comes to an end. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mehria.
Thank you.
Dave, I'm going to put you on the spot here and give you the opportunity to ask the first set of questions.
So not a spot, Patrick, and I just wanted to thank Mehria for all the hard work that she did for the OPFA. We now have a database that we will use to go forward with, and it provides us with the information that that lets us know about tree bylaws. So Mehria, I know there's probably lots of questions, so I'm just going to ask you one. You've done a good job in identifying all of these, and my question is how would you recommend that anybody with an interest in ensuring that good forestry practices are incorporated into bylaws, how do you think they should go forward and approach municipalities with that?
So first of all, these municipalities, they have to be aware about the importance of good forestry practice within the bylaw. And so the best way to do that would be, and I personally think that public education is the first step towards including good forestry practice within a bylaw, because that public can actually force these municipalities to amend these bylaws. When I was doing my research, I saw that some places that wanted to introduce tree bylaws, they couldn't go through with it because of public backlash. So hence, if we turn that towards the public and inform them about the importance of good forestry practice, then we can actually kind of force these municipalities to include good forestry practices within the bylaw. And as we saw, places with higher population densities and immigrant populations, they had tree bylaws. Some of them had good forestry practices, some of them didn't. So places, and although there's lesser tree cover there, a lot of these municipalities are taking part in challenges like the million trees planting and stuff. So when those trees are planted, it will be really important to protect them. So I think public involvement has to be the first step, because right now, a lot of people do not care about what is happening around them in terms of the urban forest cover.
Is there a role for academia in there?
There's definitely a role for academia in there, because so Toronto, or the University of Toronto, is one of the most, you can say, diverse universities, and people from all around the world come here. And so a lot of people do end up staying in Canada, different parts of Canada. So educating the students there creates the first step, and these students then go on to educate their families. Academia can also help in schools because, as we can see, when you put something in a child's mind, they can like go on to their parents and, you know, blabber about it to them. And so that is another important part. And I think one of the major aspects of this, and it could be very simple, is that all of the newcomers that are coming to Canada for temporary or permanent timeframes, they need to be informed about the importance of the urban forest cover and about the bylaws that exist there. So there's no, you can say, they're not committing any harmful forestry activities just because they had no knowledge about them.
Thank you. I'm going to stop there to give everybody else a chance. Thank you, Mehria.
Thank you, Dave.
Very much, Dave. Daniela, you had a question. Please go ahead.
Hey, Mehria and Jay, good work. Really interesting. One thing that stands out, it's definitely, and the spin that you could add to your paper, that you just proved that we have reactive policies.
Yeah.
Once when we are down, very low, then we react. But I had a question, little bit more about your methods, and maybe just clarify that for me. It's when you look at the lower tier municipalities,
yeah,
did you look at individual tree bylaws, or did you look only at forestry related? It doesn't come quite clear about that.
Yeah, so we did not distinguish between what kind of bylaws there were. We only distinguished if there were any tree-related bylaws, because that was the first step. And these bylaws varied between public and private property, but also woodland conservation.
So
So
that's a huge difference between
yeah,
the individual one, because you cannot apply good forestry practices, obviously, to individual trees.
yeah, you cannot. But there were some guidelines in those bylaws where they had very clear distinctions on what kind of trees you can cut. Some of them even mentioned what you can replant and all of these information.
Yeah, but definitely the policies related
Yeah.
to woodlands or group of trees, forest versus individual trees.
Yeah.
It's just maybe separate the two, or because otherwise the message will be in a way wrong. It's
Yeah,
just
no,
clear up that in your method. Other than that, good work.
thank you.
Jay, go ahead.
Hey, Maria, nice job.
Thanks.
Maria, do you think it would be useful to have this go to the press, focusing on the champions and laggards, and hence getting people's backs up when their municipalities doing a bad job, people from good municipalities doing a good job? Do you think that would help the situation or not?
Honestly, it could help, but and yeah, by press you mean like, you know, your social media and your television, am I right? Like news channels and stuff. And
I guess you're more modern than I was thinking newspapers, but yes, I think you're probably right.
no, I mean, we can take different approaches for the different demographics that we're dealing with. So for people who don't have access to social media or who don't deal with social media, we can definitely write articles and like information in the newspapers and maybe run little segments on the news channels. But for the newer generation, we can definitely, there's so many different initiatives online where you can educate people. And I feel like social media does have a broader reach. So yeah, and it's also cheaper and sometimes free to do that. And I feel like these municipalities they'll have better luck doing that.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandy, go ahead.
Just a quick question, I guess, but and I'm glad you put this slide up here, the laggards and the champions. And you know, having been working in this world for quite the last number of years, you know, if you talk to the champions, the ones you've identified as champions, they're the ones with the bylaws, and they always say, we wish we didn't have the bylaws. And if you went to the laggards and talked to them, they wish they did have the bylaws. So nobody seems to be happy. And what I wonder with this kind of study, like you next need to go down and talk to Kitchener and Stratford and Whitby and find out why is it that, you know, everyone who has a bylaw wish they didn't, and everyone who doesn't have one wish they did, do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be a very interesting study to conduct, and we can definitely, you know, do a full study with questionnaires going out, even interviews. I personally think that these places where all the champions are, the social demographics there do affect the public perception of these trees. And they're like, oh, we don't want to be told what to do on our own properties, is what I read in a lot of news articles.
Right, right. Well, and I guess the thing is does it make a difference? In the end, having tree bylaws, do they make a difference?
They definitely do make a difference. I personally think that having any kind of bylaw makes a huge difference. It just brings discipline into anything. And I'm going to give an example that's not related to forestry, but with recent COVID-19 and everything and using masks, they could have just asked people to wear masks, but that wasn't really successful. And then there came the bylaw, and it's more effective, and people are wearing masks, although there's some exceptions. But you can see that when there's a bylaw, people do fear the law and the fear of the punishment. And although there's still people who would not follow them, but it's very important to have bylaws, yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
It seems like some sort of combination of carrots and sticks may be necessary to
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much, Mehria, for an interesting presentation. It's time to move on to our next speaker now.